Documentaries cover a wide range of subjects, such as nature, historical events, famous people, and classic cars, for example. But some of these films are far darker than most, as they deal with infamous crimes that were committed years ago and offer a unique perspective into the finer details of those investigations. There are a few documentaries released in recent years that have had as big of an impact on the global consciousness as Blue Planet 2. The nature documentary opened many people's eyes to the amount of plastic in the world's oceans, and the very real impact it's having on ocean life. After the outrage caused by the documentary, many governments around the world were pressured into taking actions to limit or completely ban single-use plastic. Blue Planet started life as a simple nature documentary series. Created by the BBC, it was originally going to be a follow-up to Blue Planet, which had been released years earlier. The documentary looked at all the different ocean ecosystems, telling stories of different marine life and how they interacted with one another. Like the first documentary, it was narrated by conservationist and nature expert David Attenborough. But as the documentary makers worked on the film, they were shocked by just how much plastic they were seeing. According to the BBC, the documentary team picked up each and every piece of plastic they saw, collecting a huge amount of trash. Traditionally, these documentaries would shy away from covering how humans have impacted wildlife, even if that wildlife regularly comes into contact with humans. But when they saw just how much plastic waste the animals were interacting with, it was difficult to avoid the amount of plastic being seen. It had also become part of the story they were trying to tell, and avoiding plastic meant only telling part of the story of the world's oceans. Most of the documentary series played out like a normal nature documentary. It wasn't until the final episode that the amount of plastic in the world's ocean was really revealed. Scenes from the documentary, including things like birds accidentally feeding plastic to its young after picking up the waste from the sea. The movement to reduce the amount of plastic entering the world's oceans began in 2016, the year before Blue Planet was released, but the documentary made the topic a part of regular conversation. The scenes of struggling wildlife made people want to see how things could change. Blue Planet 2 was the most watched television program in the UK in 2017, but it was also broadcast around the world. According to some reports, streaming the series in China actually slowed down the internet there. The documentary had a global reach. Many people took individual steps to reduce their own plastic waste. Reusable water bottles became more mainstream, and people began putting pressure on companies to change their ways. One of those companies was BBC itself, which eliminated single-use plastic from its offices, but many felt that more needed to be done. The Blue Planet effect has been credited with making governments tackle single-use plastic. In the years after the documentary was released, the UK government announced a series of restrictions on single-use plastics, such as shopping bags. The most famous of these restrictions was on plastic straws, a movement which was seen in the United States and other countries. Microbeads in wash-off products like face wash were also banned. It's now nearly a decade since Blue Planet 2 was released. Scholars have tried to look into just how much of an effect the documentary had on reducing plastic waste in the ocean. Many people have claimed to reduce their own plastic use, but researchers haven't necessarily seen that to be the case. The Blue Planet effect has also been criticized for ignoring problems like waste from fishing nets, which make up a large portion of plastic waste in the ocean. But the documentary did make the conversation about plastic waste more mainstream, and the outcome of those discussions is something many people live with every day. Online dating can be a very daunting experience that often ends in disaster. But no one could have predicted the events that are covered in the documentary Lover, Stalker, Killer, which was created by Sam Hopkinson. It focuses on the case of Dave Krupa, who moved to Omaha in 2012 after his relationship with his longtime girlfriend, Amy Flora, came to an end. He decided to turn over a new leaf and accepted a job offer as an auto repair shop manager in Omaha. Having not dated anyone new for a long time, he decided to join the online dating site called Plenty of Fish, and before long he got a message from a woman named Shanna Elizabeth Gullier, or Liz for short. They decided to meet up in person, and they seemed to hit it off, both being single parents with similar interests. They went on a few more dates, though Dave made it clear that he was not interested in an exclusive relationship. About 6 months later, he met Carrie Farver when she walked into the repair shop. He was instantly attracted to her, and they started talking. He decided to ask Carrie out on a date, and she agreed, but that decision would prove fatal. Their first date went well, but Carrie then made it clear that she wasn't interested in a serious relationship while in Dave's apartment, and this suited Dave well. When the date was over, Carrie left the apartment, and in the outside hallway, she ran into Shanna, who had arrived uninvited. Carrie would end up staying at Dave's apartment on several occasions since her office was located close by, and they soon became very close. On the 13th of November, 2012, she remained in the apartment when Dave went to work, and they made plans to spend some time together later that evening. While at work, he became concerned when he received a text from Carrie in which she stated that she wanted to move in with him, something she'd never expressed any interest in. When he replied that he thought it was a bad idea, his phone was inundated with texts in which Carrie told him she hated him and that she never wanted to see him again since she'd met someone else anyway. It would only be 2 days later that he heard from her again. This time, she stated that David ruined her life, that he was a bad person and that she hated him. It would later come to light that Carrie was on prescribed medication for bipolar disorder. Her mother, Nancy, was taken aback when she received a message from Carrie, in which she stated that she decided to take a job in Kansas, which seemed extremely unlikely. Carrie could not be contacted, and she was reported as missing, but the messages to Dave's phone kept coming, and she'd started to mention Shanna, whose garage was soon vandalized. During the resulting investigation, Shanna's phone was analyzed, and it would come to light that she was the one sending these harassing messages while pretending to be Carrie. They also found an email in which she posed as David's previous girlfriend, and in which she admitted to ending Carrie's life. Further evidence that was found proved Shanna had indeed ended Carrie's life, and despite Carrie's remains never being found, Shanna was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Around 2007, a series of dominoes started to fall. This quickly led to banking collapses around the world and the 2008 financial crisis. The impact of this crisis was clear for ordinary people in the United States to see, but understanding just why things were so bad was much more difficult. In 2010, Charles Ferguson produced the documentary Inside Job, which helped to shed some light on that mystery. The main consequences of the film was raising awareness within the general public, but it also caused some significant policy changes at top universities in the United States. Inside Job is an extensive documentary. At 2 hours long, it looked at every aspect of the financial crisis, starting with how things had gotten to the state they were in 2007, how each crucial financial mechanism actually worked, and the people and regulators who should have stopped the disaster from happening. Included in this last group were economic academics and university professors who studied different parts of the financial system. In an ideal world, academics producing studies on financial mechanisms and the economies of different countries should provide important insights into how things work. The studies themselves may not be accessible to the general public, but they would highlight potential dangers. People whose jobs are to translate academic speak to the general public can then share findings, helping to keep economic institutions accountable. But not everyone producing these studies does so without biases. One example highlighted in the documentary was a study conducted about the economic stability of Iceland. In 2000, the country started to shift towards deregulation with the privatization of banks. Just a few years before the financial crisis, American economist Frederick Mishkin traveled to Iceland to study the system there. The paper claimed that everything was great in the country, and the economic fundamentals were strong. It was just 2.5 years before the country suffered a major financial crisis. On the surface, it may have seemed like a simple mistake on Mishkin's part. The economist is actually interviewed in the documentary and blames his analysis on trusting what the banks had told him. But it's also pointed out that Mishkin received $124,000 for co-authoring the report. No mention of the conflict of interest was found anywhere in the report. Mishkin wasn't alone in taking payments from the institutions he was supposed to be studying. Many economists and academics did the same thing. It's impossible to say for certain how many intentionally changed their findings to please the people who paid them. but there was always the chance of unintentional biases. Most of the time, the conflict of interest wasn't shared. This was highlighted in a section of the documentary. When university representatives were asked about this, they claimed they didn't see a problem. One representative claimed that he couldn't imagine any study author not sharing a conflict of interest, even though it wasn't required by the university. In the next scene, an economist admitted to doing just that. After the documentary was released, it sparked considerable anger in the general public. For many, it was the first time that anybody had really explained why the financial crisis had happened. The documentary also highlighted that the people who had caused the crisis were still the people in charge at the time of release. Pressure was put on universities to change the way they handled conflicts of interest. Many took steps to improve their policies, including Columbia Business School. The new policy required professors to publicly disclose all outside activities, including consulting, that might create conflicts of interest. Columbia wasn't alone in making these changes, but according to Ferguson, there was still more that needed to be done. Speaking in 2012, he believed that if significant changes didn't occur, the 2008 crisis would be repeated. The documentary Snowtown is not for the faint of heart. It's been described as unwatchable by many viewers, but not because of a lack of talent from its director, Justin Kurzel, but thanks to the subject matter. It explains and recreates a series of fatal attacks carried out by 4 men: John Bunting, Robert Wagner, James Vlasakis, and Mark Hayden, who was found guilty to a lesser degree. The documentary references the South Australian town where these crimes occurred. The case began on May 20th, 1999, when police found the remains of 8 people in plastic barrels stored in a disused bank vault. The attacks were carried out by Robert Bunting, the leader, James Wagner, and Mark Vlasakis. Bunting ordered the attacks due to his hatred of certain people, including family members of the group. Bunting and Wagner targeted and abducted people with mental and physical disabilities. They subjected them to maltreatment, often shown graphically in the film, making viewers uneasy. Bunting's motives were likely to satisfy his need for violence, often choosing victims randomly or based on unproven suspicions. A forensic psychiatrist suggested Bunting was a psychopath who enjoyed his victims' suffering, forcing them to call him Master, God, or Lord Sir. Suspicion fell on Bunting and his associates in 1997 after Elizabeth Hayden inexplicably disappeared. The investigation led to the discovery of the bank vault barrels and 2 more victims in Bunting's backyard. Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden were arrested, and Vlasakis was arrested shortly after. What followed was the longest trial in South Australia's history at that time. 12 victims were identified. Bunting was charged with 11 murders and received 11 consecutive life sentences without parole. Wagner was charged with 10 counts and received 10 life sentences. Vlasakis pleaded guilty to 3 and received 4 life sentences. Hayden admitted to concealing 2 sets of remains, but was convicted of aiding in the disposal of 5 and was sentenced to 25 years. Court orders suppressed the case details until 2011, when director Justin Kurzel requested their release for his documentary. The horrific nature of the crimes prompted Snowtown residents to consider changing the town's name to Rosetown, an idea rejected due to a subsequent rise in dark tourism. When Gasland was nominated for an award at the 2011 Oscars, it was the most controversial documentary on the list. It attracted negative attention from oil and gas companies, and the filmmakers claimed that a campaign was ongoing to discredit the conclusions made in the documentary. But despite any efforts from oil and gas companies, the documentary went on to influence an anti-fracking movement, eventually leading to local and statewide bans in the United States. Before the release of the 2010 film Gasland, fracking wasn't a word most Americans knew much about. But of those who did know what fracking was, many had a negative impression of it. The documentary begins with director and writer Josh Fox at his Pennsylvania home. He'd been offered a signing bonus of $100,000 to allow an oil and gas company to drill for natural gas on his land. Others in nearby communities had gotten similar offers, but when they took them, they noticed something strange about their water. According to these residents, it bubbled. It had a strange smell and was making them sick. One family even claimed that it could be set on fire. Fox began an investigation, going to places in the South and West where fracking had been in action for years. Across multiple states, he came across families facing the same problem. Water in their wells had become toxic and undrinkable. Some were able to show Fox the tap water catching fire. Others didn't want to risk even turning the water on. After complaints to gas companies, they'd been given filtration systems which didn't always work, or were supplied with cisterns that the company filled up twice a week. Fracking works by pumping a mixture of water, sand, and chemicals through pipes deep into the bedrock. These fracture the bedrock, allowing for natural gas and other resources to flow more freely. According to the oil and gas companies, this happens much deeper underground than groundwater layers, so there shouldn't have been any mixing of the two. But residents were finding not only natural gas in their water supplies, but also some of the chemicals that were being used in the process. The documentary also shows Fox trying to get in touch with anybody from these companies to share their side of the story, but each time they refuse. It's only when the representatives have to face Congress that their claims about fracking safety are shared. After the documentary was released, the same companies were much more keen to put across their point of view. They claimed that Fox had misrepresented information about a law that exempted fracking from the Safe Drinking Act, and alleged that water supplies had been contaminated long before fracking began. They also pointed to a report by the Environmental Protection Agency that claimed there was no evidence that fracking caused any danger to drinking water. In 2016, 6 years after Gasland was released, a new APA report contradicted that statement. The new report stated that fracking could contaminate drinking water under some circumstances. Despite the protests of gas and oil companies, Gasland started a conversation around fracking in local communities and even eventually internationally. A study found that the documentary played a huge role in gathering support for a law in New York that banned fracking statewide. Other states had more local laws preventing the gas extraction method. Gasland impacted perceptions of fracking as far away as the UK. Companies claimed they had to take extra steps to show that they were addressing concerns about water contamination after people watched the documentary. The documentary Team Foxcatcher focuses on John DuPont, a wealthy philanthropist and amateur freestyle wrestling supporter, who created the Team Foxcatcher wrestling team at his estate in Newton Square, Pennsylvania. He was also interested in other types of sports, and the 1965 U.S. Pentathlon Championship was held at this same estate. He would then go on to become a manager for the 1976 Montreal Olympic Pentathlon team, and it was only in the 1980s that his focus shifted to wrestling. He became the head coach of Villanova University's wrestling team, after which he designed and constructed a training facility at his estate, which had been renamed Foxcatcher Farm. This saw the creation of Team Foxcatcher, one member of which was Mark Schultz, a former Olympic champion. Mark's brother Dave was appointed as head coach of the team, but he was also training for the 1996 Olympic Games. But DuPont's life started to take an unfortunate turn when he started drinking heavily and using illegal substances. He would lose his temper for no apparent reason and had started collecting firearms, which was a bad combination. He was under the illusion that he himself was a champion wrestler, and anyone who disagreed with him was soon met by his explosive temper. According to those who knew him at the time, an already eccentric DuPont was growing increasingly paranoid. Many of the wrestlers on the estate considered leaving, but decided to stay since they were learning a lot from Dave, who was seen as a wrestling legend. After DuPont's mother passed away, his mental state only deteriorated further, and conditions at the farm became unbearable. He started pointing out Disney cartoon characters that he could see on the property, but that were not there. He also stated that the trees surrounding the house were uprooting themselves, after which they would walk around the grounds for reasons unknown. At one point, he became convinced that a flock of geese was conspiring against him using black magic, and he fired at them with one of his many weapons. Furthermore, the wrestlers were forbidden from using treadmills in the boxing gym because he believed that they could be used to turn back time. He believed that he was being watched by what he called enemies, and he hired extra security to patrol the estate grounds. His crumbling mental health would take a fatal turn on the 26th of January, 1996, when DuPont asked his security consultant to take him to Dave's house. The consultant did as he was asked, but became very nervous upon realizing that DuPont had a firearm with him. They arrived at the house, and according to reports, Dave greeted them warmly, but DuPont suddenly started screaming at Dave, asking him if he had a problem with him. Before Dave could answer, DuPont produced the firearm, pointed it at him, and fired, ending his life on the spot. The consultant produced his own weapon and trained on DuPont, who calmly got back into the vehicle. He then drove back to the estate and locked himself inside. His wife Nancy called 911 and stated outright that DuPont had lost his mind. It took 2 days to convince him to come out of the house, but when he found the building to be too cold, he handed himself over to the awaiting police. His defense of insanity was rejected, and he was sentenced to 13 to 30 years in prison, where he passed away in 2010. Sometimes, a documentary alone isn't enough to change a law or a policy, but it can be just one step in the road to making a significant difference. This was the case with the 2004 documentary Stealing a Nation. When journalist John Pilger began working on a documentary about Diego Garcia and the rest of the Chagos Islands, most people in Britain had never heard of the archipelago. The islands lie in the Indian Ocean, around halfway between Africa and India. They'd been a British colony since the end of the Napoleonic era. In the 1960s, they were home to around 2,000 people who were typically of African and South Indian descent. The Chagosians had lived in the islands for generations and had a simple and peaceful way of life. That changed in the 1960s, when nearby Mauritius gained its independence from Britain. The Chagos Islands were not part of that deal. They became known as the British Indian Ocean Authority, and the government had other plans for the island. Diego Garcia was the largest and most populous of the islands. It was an idyllic place to live. Unfortunately for the Chagosians, it was also in just the right place for the United States military. With operations in the Indian Ocean becoming more important for the US, it needed a base in the area. Another island was considered, but a species of endangered turtle called that island home, so Diego Garcia was chosen instead. The British and US governments worked in secret to deceive Parliament, Congress, and the people of Diego Garcia. Food on the Chagos Islands was restricted, the people were threatened, and their pets were taken away. Eventually, the entire population of the Chagos Islands were removed to make way for a US military base. Ever since then, the Chagosians have been fighting to be allowed to return home. By 2004, they'd already won a high court case in London, which determined their expulsion from the islands was illegal. They hoped that would mean returning to the islands in the immediate future. By the time the documentary was made, that still wasn't the case. Stealing the Nation resembles a true crime documentary. The first part of the film focuses on the Chagosian people, what their life was like before and what it's like at the time of filming. But the rest of the documentary shows just how the British and American governments committed their crime and tried to cover it up from anyone who might hold them accountable. Secret memos and documents were revealed, showing just how cruel the thought process surrounding the deal was. As it stood at the time the documentary was made, a royal prerogative had been invoked to stop the Chagosian people from returning to their islands, bypassing Parliament and the courts that had said the expulsion was illegal. There would be still 2 decades of fighting left before the Chagosians could return home. But for many in Britain, stealing the nation was the first time that they'd learned of the actions of their government. The film worked to improve public awareness of the issue, and support for the cause spread. The British and American people now knew what the Chagosians were fighting for. Despite this, the British government continued to try to prevent the return of the islands, including setting up a marine life sanctuary. After pressure from the international community, an agreement was finally signed by the UK and Mauritius to give Mauritius sovereignty over the islands. The treaty has still not been ratified, but it's hoped the Chagosians' fight may soon be over. The case involving NFL football player Pat Tillman, who later became an Army Ranger, is one that contains many twists and turns, all of which are covered in the documentary The Tillman Story, which was directed by Amir Barlev and narrated by Josh Brolin. Tillman's football career started at Arizona State University, after which he started playing for the Arizona Cardinals NFL team. He made quite an impression in his rookie year, besting the record for the most tackles in a season by a rookie. But in 2002, he and his brother decided to join the Army, after which Pat was sent to Iraq. 2 years into his military service, he was sent to Afghanistan, and on the 22nd of April 2004, he was part of a platoon that was stationed in that country's southeastern mountains. An armored vehicle in the trailing part of his platoon was attacked by enemies, and in mere moments, chaos erupted. Several soldiers positioned in a Humvee decided to fire back, but ended up firing at Pat and his fellow Rangers. Pat was struck and unfortunately lost his life along with another soldier. His family was told that his life was ended during an ambush by the Taliban and that he had fought bravely before he was fatally struck. He was awarded the Silver Star for his heroism, but the truth of what happened that day would eventually be revealed, despite the best efforts of the military and the US government to cover it up. It came to light that before the ambush started, Pat's platoon had approached a canyon in the mountains, and they immediately knew that it was the perfect place for the enemy to lie in wait. This was well known to the commanding officers who were present, who then proceeded to make a baffling decision. They ordered the platoon to split up and told the front section to drive through the canyon. Upon doing so, the enemy opened fire, and thanks to the ensuing friendly fire, Pat was struck in the forehead 3 times. But it would later be revealed that the friendly fire started not with the inexperienced soldiers, but with the platoon leader. Pat was fighting next to an Afghan militia fighter who, despite donning an American uniform, was mistaken by the platoon leader as an enemy soldier. He raised his weapon at the man and opened fire, ending his life and resulting in the wild discharge of firearms towards Pat and half of the platoon. It was then realized that Pat lost his life to friendly fire, and the cover-up immediately started. His uniform and weapons were never sent back to the US to be analyzed, and it should be noted that the Silver Star is never presented to a soldier who lost his life to friendly fire. His clothes and body armor were destroyed, and his weapons were never recovered. The military then told his family that Pat had been struck by fire from members of the Taliban. During subsequent investigations, it was discovered that high-ranking officials knew that Pat's life was ended by fellow soldiers, and that General Stanley McChrystal intentionally decided to deceive his family by awarding him the Silver Star. The soldier who fired the weapon that ended Pat's life was never identified, despite several others coming forward to state that thanks to the ballistic work, his identity was known to the military. But it was decided that the entire platoon was at fault, and hence that particular soldier's name was never made public. Camp Lejeune is a military training base located in North Carolina. For decades, it's been the home of the Marine Corps, their families, and civilians who work for the base. And from at least 1953 to 1985, the water supply was poisoning residents. The 2011 documentary, Semper Fi Always Faithful, follows one former Marine trying to hold the military accountable to get help for the water survivors. When exactly the contamination started is still unknown. The base used solvents for everything from laundry to cleaning aircraft. Waste material needed to be carefully disposed of, but it was instead buried near the base's water wells. Volatile organic compounds gradually seeped into the water supply. By 1981, the levels were at a concentration hundreds or even thousands of times greater than what was safe. It was in that year that testing was completed, and the base commanders learned of the danger. But the water continued to be used for another 4 years, until the well was capped in 1985. The people who'd been drinking, bathing in, and using the water to clean had no idea about the harmful chemicals they'd been consuming, until it was too late. Since then, water survivors have noticed a great number of residents who are suffering from rare health conditions. These include adults, like a former Marine, suffering from a degenerative neurological condition, and a large cluster of adults with cancer. But the biggest impact was seen in children who were born and lived on the base. Some were born with deformities, while others developed rare forms of cancer. One of these in the latter group was Janie Ensminger, the daughter of Master Sergeant Jerry Ensminger. Janie was born and lived her early years on the base before contracting a rare form of leukemia. After learning about the contaminated water, it didn't take long for her father to connect the contamination to her disease. He joined the fight to get justice for his daughter and others who suffered, Semper Fi is the motto of the US Marine Corps, meaning always faithful. The documentary title reflected how Emsminger and other Marines had faithfully served the US military throughout their entire careers, and now felt that that same faith wasn't being shown to them. Even after groups were set up to investigate the extent and any effects of contamination, water survivors got the sense that not enough was being done. Many health conditions were not officially connected to the contamination, and any support any survivors had access to was limited. Ensminger and other water survivors continued to push not just for public acknowledgement of the disaster, but for help for those who'd been affected. The documentary raised awareness of Camp Lejeune contamination, one of the biggest water contaminations in US history, and the cover-up that water survivors felt was taking place. It gave people like Ensminger a voice and a platform to explain what he felt needed to be done to work towards making some kind of amends. In 2011, a bill was introduced into Congress which would grant military veterans and their families better access to health care for their ongoing medical conditions. In 2012, Ensminger was invited to the White House as the president officially signed the Honoring America's Veterans and Caring for Camp Lejeune Families Act into law. The act was given the nickname Janie's Law. Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky's 1992 debut documentary, Brother's Keeper, focused on a 1990 murder case and subsequent bizarre trial in Munnsville, New York. It introduced the four isolated Ward brothers, Bill, Delbert, Roscoe, and Lyman, who grew up on a dairy farm without electricity or running water. By 1990, Bill, then 64, was severely ill with debilitating headaches and stomach pains, rapidly losing weight. On June 6th, Bill was found deceased. Police suspected his illiterate 59-year-old brother, Delbert, had smothered Bill with a pillow to end his suffering. Delbert was coerced into signing a 4-page confession that he couldn't even read, but later he retracted that confession. Despite the confession, the defense argued Delbert's illiteracy made the confession invalid. So Delbert took the stand, asserting his closeness to Bill and denying harming him. The local community strongly supported Delbert, holding fundraisers for his bail and defense. The trial became national news, attracting celebrity attention. Berlinger and Sinofsky filmed the trial footage for the documentary. After 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a not guilty verdict, delighting Delbert's supporters. He left the court planning a celebration with his brothers. Delbert became a minor celebrity himself until his death in 1998. His 2 remaining brothers passed away in 2007, but the Ward family remains known for the case that nearly imprisoned an innocent man. The Territory is a unique documentary filmed over the course of 4 years in the Amazon rainforest. Many documentaries have told of the importance of the biggest tropical rainforest on Earth, but The Territory gets its message across by telling the story of one community and handing over the cameras to that indigenous population. The Ureo-Wow-Wow people are one of the many indigenous groups that call the rainforest their home. They live in the Rondônia region of Brazil, in 6 villages on the borders of the Ureo-Wow-Wow territory. When they were first contacted by non-indigenous people in the 80s, their population was in the thousands. As of 2023, only 152 remain. Ureo-Wow-Wow territory is supposed to be protected, but with the rise of anti-indigenous settlements in Brazil, more and more illegal settlers have been encroaching on the land. So-called land grabbers have acted with immunity. Forest fires started to clear the way for farms. Violence against indigenous people has broken out in the past. Even though this activity is illegal, it's difficult for indigenous populations to fight back. The makers of the Territory documentary started by working with an indigenous activist who was initially cautious about their intention, but they won over her trust and were invited to meet the Ureo-Wow-Wow people. The documentary team then spent time in the community, getting to know the people and listening to their stories. Many documentaries have been made about the Amazon rainforest and the dangers posed by deforestation and settlers, but it can often seem like a faraway problem. The Territory puts names and faces to the people trying to fight back against this, and allows the Ureo-Wow-Wow people to tell their stories. Viewers became familiar with people like Ari, who had his life taken during the course of filming in what was believed to be a deliberate attack. The film also highlighted Batate, an 18-year-old who was nominated to become the new president of the Jupao Association. The documentary was filmed over the course of 4 years, including 2020. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Arreo Wow Wow closed off their territory to outsiders, including the documentary makers. But they now had access to cameras, allowing them to film their own content and show what they thought was important. It gave the documentary a unique perspective and allowed outsiders to better connect with the community. The new technology has also helped with the pushback against land grabbers in more direct ways. The community has begun to use drones to document the activity of illegal settlers and record deforestation. The territory gave equal time to the indigenous population and the settlers. It interviewed people who wanted to farm the area and let them tell their side of the story. But the settlers don't come out of the documentary looking well, and their crimes are caught on camera, helping to fight to bring them to justice. The territory helped to promote the rights of all indigenous people living in Brazil, both with outsiders in the country and abroad. When Brazil elected a new president, he set up the Ministry for the Indigenous Peoples and chose an indigenous activist to lead it. New policies that seem to be more aligned with the goals of people like those featured in the territory have also been introduced. Abroad, the documentary was shown in Brussels for impact screenings with over 500 stakeholders. The Impact campaign was designed to promote EU policies that will protect the rainforest, helping to push the organization's anti-deforestation regulation. Schizophrenia is a mental disorder that can wreak havoc not only on the lives of those who suffer from it, but also on those close to them. With the proper medication, it can be controlled, but in the case of Jonathan Cowett, whose mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia, it changed his life forever. The events during this time in his life are presented in a documentary called Tarnation, which was produced by Cowett himself. It details the events of his childhood, which was not a happy one, and the hardships that he had to go through while living with his mentally ill mother. When Cowett was 12 years old, a friend of his mother's, who was a seller of illegal substances, gave him a substance to smoke, but unbeknownst to Cowett, it was laced with much stronger substances, and he had to be taken to the hospital. He was then told that he'd been diagnosed with dissociative disorder, and his life was completely changed from that point forward. He started feeling separated from the world around him, and a year later, he started sneaking into clubs while disguised as a female. He felt that every aspect of his life was like being in a movie, and he started filming strange horror films, which he and a friend recorded with a Super 8 camera. His situation was further exacerbated by the fact that he was a homosexual and living in Texas, where during that time, it was seen as unacceptable. Cowett's mother, Renee, also had a troubled childhood. Her life changed forever when she was just 12 years old after falling off her family's house's roof. During the accident, a nerve in her leg became damaged, and as a result, she lost the use of both legs. Believing that it was all in her mind, her parents sent her to undergo electroshock therapy for 2 years, and by the time that her treatment was complete, she developed not only schizophrenia, but also bipolar disorder. Her parents were then told that the damage to her legs was very real, and that she would have recovered without treatment anyway, but by this time the damage had been done. Thanks to her mental disorders, she would spend decades in and out of medical facilities, and eventually she and Cowett became homeless. During this time, she witnessed Renee being assaulted, and it brought back memories of his time in foster care, when he was repeatedly assaulted by the family with whom he was placed. For more than 2 decades, he spent his time recording footage with his Super 8 camera, and much of this footage was used in his documentary, along with photos of his family. His favorite genre of film was horror, and whenever he watched a movie, he would gather his markers and paper, which were bought for him by his grandfather, and sketch out every scene that he could remember. Thus started his love for filmmaking, which provided him with the stability that he never had in his life as a child. As the years went by, Renee and his grandparents got older, and he ended up caring for them. He eventually decided to create Tarnation for a New York film festival on a budget of just over $200. The film became a huge success after it made an impression on a few directors, and soon it was being screened on the festival circuit. His career as a director was a success, and he managed to achieve his goal with Tarnation, which was to show Hollywood's uncaring nature towards those who suffer from mental illnesses. When the 2015 documentary Under the Dome was released, news outlets speculated whether this would be China's Silent Spring moment. Within days of its release, it was removed from the Chinese internet, but its impact was still clearly seen on social media. In the years after its release, Chinese laws on air pollution became stricter, but the problem still lingers in the air above the country's biggest cities. Under the Dome is a documentary a little over 100 minutes in length. It mostly takes the form of a TED Talk-style speech by Chai Jing, an investigative journalist and mother. Chai had previously worked for CCTV, China's state broadcaster. During her career, she'd visited one of the most polluted towns on the planet, which was located next to a coal mine. She interviewed a 6-year-old child, asking if the girl had ever seen stars or blue sky. The girl said she had seen a little blue sky, but that was it. Years later, Chai became pregnant, only to discover her unborn child had a tumor. During the documentary, she doesn't go as far as to say she believed the health problems were caused by smog, but it did trigger a new understanding of just how delicate her child's life was. She stopped working to look after her child, and one of her biggest concerns was smog. During the documentary, she revealed that less than 200 days in the past year had air quality conditions been good enough to allow her daughter outside. Carrying around a filter all day allowed her to collect some of the contaminants that are normally only seen as haze in the air of China's largest cities. When those contaminants were analyzed, scientists found that some of the most dangerous particles were at levels 14 times higher than China's safe limit. This was a higher level than even the coal mining town that Chai had visited years earlier. Under the Dome goes into detail explaining how these particles harm the human body and what needs to be done to change things. The documentary went viral online. In under 48 hours, it received more than 100 million views and was one of the most discussed topics on Chinese social media. Chai wasn't the only mother who had concerns about her child's health, and the personal importance of the documentary spoke to many of the viewers. Western media outlets described it as China's Silent Summer, referring to an American book released in the 1960s that highlighted the dangers of pesticides. Silent Summer marked a turning point in attitudes to the environment and eventually led to many of the dangerous chemicals being banned. But conversations about smog and air pollution in China didn't begin with Under the Dome. In fact, in the same year the documentary was released, new laws about air pollution were made. But many have argued these didn't go far enough and wouldn't be enforced at more local levels. As Chai revealed in the documentary, many people felt that stopping air pollution wasn't as important as economic growth. The documentary itself had been vetted by the Chinese government before its release. It was initially endorsed by ministers, but after less than a week, it was removed from online platforms. Online reviews were taken down, and outlets were told to stop promoting it, but this didn't stop the conversations around air pollution and smog. Since the release of Under the Dome, more laws and policies have been put into place to try to limit air pollution in China. Smog is still a problem in many cities, but the air has gradually become cleaner as the country focuses on efforts of renewable energy and electric vehicles. Being a member of an organized crime family has to be a very stressful life, but serving as their hitman must be even more anxiety-inducing. This is the life that Richard Kuklinski chose, and his life and crimes are discussed in the documentary The Iceman Confesses: Secrets of a Mafia Hitman. Kuklinski's problems started at home when he was still young, when both his parents started becoming violent against him and his siblings. He dropped out of school after completing the 8th grade and then started a life of crime. He became a bootlegger and soon married a woman named Barbara Pedrisi, who had no idea that he was a career criminal until after his arrest. He told her that he was a businessman, and neither Barbara nor their children ever suspected otherwise. Due to his bootlegging activities, he caught the attention of the Gambino family, but he's since claimed to have worked with several other crime families. These include the De Cavallantes and Genoveses. He started carrying out hits, the first of which was carried out in 1980 when he met with George Malabend, who wanted to sell him a few videotapes. Kuklinski ended his life and placed his remains in a barrel. In another videotape meeting that went awry, he ended the life of Louis Masgay in 1981, and his remains were only discovered more than a year later. Kuklinski was named the Iceman thanks to this case, when it was found that Masgay's remains had been frozen and that ice crystals were present in his body. But Kuklinski thought nothing of attacking his own colleagues, the first of which was Gary Smith, a member of his own burglary gang. Kuklinski ended his life via poisoning and strangulation before hiding his body under a bed in a motel. The second was also a member of this gang, Daniel Deppner, who was also found to have been poisoned and who was not found for a year after his demise. He then ended the life of Paul Hoffman, a customer of Kuklinski's, who wanted to buy prescription medication from him. By this time, investigators were hot on his heels, and they devised a plan to uncover his crimes. He was duped into believing that an undercover federal agent was a customer who wanted to order a hit, and when Kuklinski agreed, he was taken into custody. He was charged with ending the lives of Smith, Deppner, Maliband, Masgay, and Peter Calabro, a New York City police officer. He claimed to have ended the lives of at least 100 people, but this was never proven, and he was ultimately sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms behind bars. Most people don't think much about how the food they eat ends up on their plate. Food Inc. was an American documentary that aimed to change that through individual actions and policy changes. In the 18 years since the documentary was released, it can be debated in how much it's achieved those goals. The 2008 documentary mainly focuses on the ways the U.S. agricultural industry has changed in the past 100 years. Many innovations that have been introduced, from patented genetic modified soybeans to the use of corn products in almost everything. According to documentary maker Robert Kenner, the agricultural industry is more like a factory than a farm today, with everything optimized to make more products at the cost of quality, health, and the environment. The documentary focuses on each of those in turn, but pays particular attention to how this new factory farming is impacting American health. Some health effects are obvious. Subsidies for corn farming mean unhealthy food containing corn syrup is cheaper than healthier options. Poorer families have fewer choices and are more at risk of diseases like type 2 diabetes. In other cases, it might be less clear to the consumer how the current state of the agricultural industry has led to negative health consequences. According to the documentary, there'd been an increase in E. coli outbreaks and similar diseases. The film shows the insides of sheds where cows and pigs are raised, butchered, and processed into ground meat. The unsanitary conditions are obvious to see, but there was little pressure on the companies to change their ways. On top of that, the cows were sustained on feed containing antibiotics. The overuse of antibiotics led to resistant strains of bacteria, making it even harder to deal with infections. The consequences of these choices are made clear through the story of a mother who lost her son after he contracted hemolytic uremic syndrome. The disease came from E. coli contaminated hamburgers. The documentary shows them trying to gather support for Kevin's Law, a law that would give the Department of Agriculture the power to close down plants that contained contaminated meat. At the end of the film, a final message is given to the viewers. They're told the consumer can make a difference. By changing our eating preferences, opting for locally grown, organic produce, we can pressure major companies into changing what they buy and from whom. But we're also told to support Kevin's Law. Unfortunately, Kevin's Law, or the Meat and Poultry Pathogen Reduction and Enforcement Act, didn't pass. It was referred to the committee, but never reported on. But Food Inc. has been credited as having some impact in another future law. In 2011, the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act was passed. This gave the FDA the ability to better regulate how food is grown, harvested, and processed. The law should have helped to address many of the concerns raised in Food Inc., including the ways pathogens make their way into food products. The measures outlined in Kevin's Law are a key part of the FSMA. Unfortunately, the makers of Food Inc. didn't see their message go as far as they would like. In 2020, they began work on a sequel to the documentary. When they looked at what had changed in the 12 years since Food Inc. was released, they realized many things had only gotten worse. A new documentary was produced looking at ultra-processed foods and the way a few major companies control most of the agricultural industry in America. The subject matter of some documentaries seems almost too outlandish to be true, and the case of Frederick Borden, which is detailed in the documentary The Imposter, certainly fits that description. This strange and unnerving case started on the 3rd of May 2005 when a member of the public in Orthez, France contacted the police. He reported that he'd found a young boy called Francisco Hernandez Fernandez walking around alone at a train station, and that he clearly needed help. He seemed lost and only had his ID and a cell phone on him. He seemed shy, keeping his face covered with a muffler and a baseball cap, and had clearly been through an ordeal. But before the authorities could track him down, the boy went to a welfare office where he explained his situation. He stated that his entire family had lost their lives in a car accident in Spain. He survived but was left alone in a coma for weeks, and after he was fit to be released, he was sent to live with his uncle. But there, his uncle became abusive, and Francisco decided to relocate to France, where he was then found. He was housed at a shelter in Pau, where he explained that he was self-conscious about his body, which he claimed was covered in scars and burn marks from the accident. Hence, he was given his own room so that he wouldn't need to change in front of the other boys at the shelter. He started attending the notorious Jean Monnet College, where he was the only student allowed to wear a hat, again due to his scars. Many staff members at the school took a special interest in Francisco, since he'd suffered such trauma, and wouldn't allow anyone, including medical staff, to examine him. He soon proved to be a very good student, and he became friends with Rafael Pessoa de Almeida, who served as his tutor. Rafael found it strange that Francisco's call log and contacts on his cell phone were protected by a password, but he didn't press the issue. He soon became one of the most popular children in the school, and even performed a dance number to a Michael Jackson song in front of his class. He seemed to be coming out of his shell, but in June of that year, his case would take an unprecedented turn. A school administrator came rushing into the school's principal's office and stated that she had seen a news story about a Frenchman named Frederick Borden, who was sought for identity theft. Not only was he a 30-year-old con man, but he was also known to impersonate children, and she realized that he and Francisco looked almost identical. He was called to the office, where officers took him into custody, and when his hat was removed, it became clear he had no scars on his head as he had claimed, and to make matters worse, he was balding. While being interviewed, he revealed that he'd been impersonating children for 15 years because he didn't want to grow up. He'd been examined by doctors in the past, none of whom ever realized he was an adult. Sin by Silence is one documentary that led to a law change and helped some of the most vulnerable people in society get their lives back. In 2009, Olivia Klaus released a film that told the story of a woman being held in a California prison. They were part of a convicted women against abuse support group, and all of them were in prison for taking the lives of their husbands. Klaus had been introduced to the group years earlier, when trying to help her friend out of a domestic violence situation. She found that many of the shelters and support groups designed to help victims couldn't offer enough support. The lack of support for domestic violence victims often leads to people losing their lives. Most of the time, it's the victim, but that isn't always the case. According to the film, the majority of the women in California prisons incarcerated for taking their husbands' lives were the victims of domestic violence. More than half of them had fought back to protect themselves or their children. The CWAA was the first inmate-initiated support group designed to help women who could only escape violent partners by taking their lives. Klaus was shocked to learn their stories and continued to volunteer at the group for years. She was eventually convinced to make a documentary telling their stories and their fights for justice. In 1991, the CWAA started a letter-writing campaign to try to change the law. In their trials, evidence about battered women's syndrome was usually not permitted. When it wasn't permitted, it wasn't accurate, and juries were not allowed the information that would help to explain why the crime had taken place. The campaign was unsuccessful, and in 1992, a law was passed in California allowing for BWS to be admissible in court, and that meant that survivors of domestic violence were more likely to receive convictions of involuntary manslaughter and would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Unfortunately, the law wasn't retroactive, and members of the CWAA wouldn't benefit themselves. It would be a decade before the law was updated again, allowing women to challenge their convictions if evidence about BWS hadn't been allowed. Sin by silence showed that there were still injustices that these laws hadn't addressed. There were women in prison who'd been allowed to use the defense in their original trials, but it had been inadequate. If the same crime had occurred today, there was a good chance they would not be serving the same sentence they are now. The documentary allowed the imprisoned survivors to share their stories in their own words. Many were helping other victims and were proud that their advocacy was helping women today, even if it couldn't change their own lives. After its release, the documentary was shown to Assemblywoman Fiona Ma. In 2012, Ma introduced two bills, known as the Sin by Silence bills, as a direct response to the documentary. The bills would clarify the law further, allowing the women who'd received inadequate expert testimony during their trials to finally get justice. The new law would also help during the parole process. This paved the way for Glenda Virgil to be released from prison in June of 2013. Glenda was one of the women featured in the Sin by Silence documentary. She'd been in prison since 1987 after fighting back against her boyfriend when he threatened to take her life. After 9 parole hearings, she was finally released at the age of 66. The subject of capital punishment is an extremely divisive one. Some people believe that the death penalty will deter criminals from carrying out serious crimes, while others feel that no one has the right to decide whether someone should live or not. This is the focus of the Werner Herzog documentary Into the Abyss, which was released in November of 2011. It also details the case of a crime that was committed by 2 men, Michael Perry and Jason Burkett, in Texas in 2001. From a young age, Perry was a handful for his adoptive parents. They struggled to control him and eventually decided to send him to the Florida Everglades, where he attended counseling sessions. When this didn't work, he was sent to reform school, but he was then diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and conduct disorder. He would steal from his parents, break into houses, and he even stole the family car on one occasion and ended up crashing it. When he turned 18, he set out on his own, and despite the best efforts of his parents, his behavior had seen no improvement whatsoever. He would later admit that they gave him endless opportunities to fix his life, and that he chose to rebel instead. He ended up living on the streets of San Diego, and he developed an illegal substance addiction. He would eventually move back home and was welcomed by his parents, but he continued committing crimes. As for Burkett, he didn't have the best start to life either. His mother was an addict who used while she was pregnant, and her children were forced to fend for themselves, and they survived on food stamps and on many occasions suffered abuse at the hands of their father. And somewhere along the line, Perry and Burkett met, and they became fast friends. Then, on the 24th of October, 2001, they made the decision that changed their lives forever. They knew that a nurse, Sandra Stotler, owned a red Camaro, and they wanted to feel what it would be like to drive it. They broke into her house, and in her kitchen, Perry produced a firearm and ended her life. This was a particularly callous crime, since the 2 men and Sandra knew each other. They disposed of her body in Crater Lake, and then returned to her house to steal her car. But while they were there, her son and one of his friends arrived. The 2 men told them that there'd been a hunting accident in the nearby woods, and after taking them into the woods, they ended both of their lives. They returned to the house in Sandra's son's SUV, stole Sandra's Camaro, and fled. They were then seen at a bar, each with a new vehicle, and explained that they'd won the lottery. 6 days later, they were involved in a high-speed chase with the police and were ultimately taken into custody. Perry confessed to ending Sandra's life and told investigators where to look for the other 2 victims. He would later retract his confession, stating that he'd been coerced, and then claimed that he was in police custody at the time that the attack took place. The pair then turned on each other, but this did little to change the outcome of their cases. as both Perry and Burkett were found guilty. Burkett received a life sentence, while Perry was sentenced to be executed. According to the 2022 documentary Caught, an average of 10,000 dolphins lose their lives every year as a consequence of fishing on France's Atlantic coast. The documentary highlights just how activist organizations are trying to stop that. Within months of the documentary's release, the French government took action to try to address those concerns. The documentary was created by Age of Union and Sea Shepherd, organizations dedicated to protecting the natural environment and spreading awareness of environmental causes. At less than 40 minutes in length, Caught is focused specifically on the problem of fishing, how it impacts dolphins, and Sea Shepherd's ongoing efforts to raise awareness to this. Dolphins aren't commonly eaten in France. They're animals that most people in France would rather protect than eat. But seafood as a whole is an important part of French culture and cuisine. For most people, there's no reason why these two things should be connected. But Caught shows how fishing for common seafood is claiming the lives of countless dolphins. Dolphins are typically the victims of bycatch, where they're accidentally caught in nets. They typically try to feed on the same fish that fishermen target, so they're caught up in nets that scoop up huge numbers of fish. These dolphins can wound themselves in the nets, which cut into their skin when they struggle against them. Alternatively, if they're trapped underwater for too long, the dolphins can run out of oxygen and lose their lives. As they aren't eaten, they're typically thrown back overboard when hauled in. The documentary shows how many of these dolphins wash ashore. In just one day, there are multiple animals along a small stretch of coast, but these are only a small fraction of the dolphins that lose their lives due to fishing. Most sink into the ocean floor and are never seen again. At the time the documentary was made, the French government was aware of a problem with dolphin bycatch. In 2021, it introduced a 7-point action plan to try to combat the phenomenon. This included mandating reporting and fitting acoustic devices to try to scare away dolphins. But as Sea Shepherd pointed out, most of these points were already part of French law, or were at least voluntary. The biggest culprits were already not following the rules. In the documentary, members of the Sea Shepherd organization make it clear that nothing will change unless the general public is aware of the problem and wants to make a difference. They tried to do that by displaying the bodies of dolphins that have washed ashore in front of the Eiffel Tower and government buildings. It was a shocking, gruesome display, but it brought the problem to light. Caught attempts to do the same thing, using the more traditional route of a documentary. It made people who may have never seen a dolphin in real life realize the true extent of the problem. Not long after the documentary was released, a report was also filed showing that 910 dolphins had washed up on French shores in a matter of months. Combined with the footage from the documentary and pressure from the public, it convinced the French government to take action. No fishing zones were created in the Atlantic in an attempt to protect the dolphins. There were areas where the mammals typically lived and hunted, and where they were the most likely to be caught. Since then, there's been an annual ban of 1 month on fishing by large vessels. The ban is designed to protect dolphins. In the first year, the amount of bycatch was reduced to its lowest level since 2015. A documentary called The Barefoot Bandit, which was created by director Carly Bodmer, covers the life and crimes committed by Colton Harris Moore, who originally hails from northern Washington. During his crime spree, he posted selfies online and started amassing a huge following, but he was eventually made to face the long arm of the law. From an early age, Harris Moore took an interest in planes, and according to some, it became somewhat of an obsession, even when he was still in elementary school. His life's ambition was to become a pilot one day, but he knew that he would have to work extra hard to achieve that dream, since his family didn't have a lot of money, and his father was out of his life for most of his childhood, since he was in prison and had an illegal substance addiction. To make matters worse, his mother had a drinking problem, and Harris Moore started getting into trouble with the law when he was just 12 years old, when he was convicted of being in possession of stolen property. When he was convicted of 3 more crimes over the following year, he was sent for evaluation and diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, depression, and intermittent explosive disorder. He was eventually sent to the Griffin Home Residential Treatment Center, but decided to abscond in 2008, and an arrest warrant was issued. He then stole a car and traveled to Kamano Island, where he started breaking into houses for food and valuables to sell. His first taste of fame as a wanted fugitive came when he stole a car and was pursued by the police. He managed to avoid arrest by jumping out of the vehicle and fleeing into the woods. And in the car, investigators found several stolen items, including credit cards, a camera, and cell phones. The media started following his story, and before long, Harris Moore was dubbed the Barefoot Bandit, due to the fact that he rarely wore shoes while committing his crimes. His guilt was never in doubt, since he'd used the stolen camera to take selfies that were spread online by the press and his now growing fan base. Realizing that the law was closing in on him, Harris Moore left Kamano Island via a stolen boat and relocated to Orcas Island. Here, he committed a string of burglaries and had to flee once again, but this time he decided against using a boat. Thanks to his obsession with planes, he'd studied many airplane manuals, and in doing so, taught himself how to fly. On this occasion, he made it off the island after stealing a Cessna 182 airplane. He made an emergency landing on the Yakima Indian Reservation, once again evading capture. His crime spree only continued from there. He ended up stealing countless cars and never remained in the same area for too long. He was being sought in Washington, Reno, and Sacramento, and the police upped their investigation after he broke into a patrol car and stole police equipment, including a firearm. He stole 3 more planes, another boat, and committed many more robberies, but in 2010, his adventure finally came to an end at Harbor Island in the Bahamas after crashing a plane there. He was arrested and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He then became reclusive, removed all his social media profiles, and has rarely been seen in public. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.